Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'm going to be doing a spoiler-free review of To Flail Against Infinity, the first book in the Stargazer's War series by J.P. Valentine. Now, on this channel, I've now talked a decent amount about lit RPG especially, particularly as it is a subset of progression fantasy, but it is not the only subgenre of progression fantasy, so I've wanted to check out a few more things. This is a book that came up among a series of recommendations over on Reddit, and I will be honest, this is one I almost exclusively picked because the cover is sick. It gives me like big arcane vibes, and I was like, okay, I'm kind of curious. It's described as a sci-fi cultivation epic, so already that's piquing my interest for sure. The fact that it is really sci-fi focused is really cool. A lot of these stories tend to focus much heavier on the fantasy side of things, and I was really curious to see sort of a world where magic, in this case chi, is utilized in a sci-fi setting. Now, Cultivation Fantasy, as I mentioned, alongside lit RPG, is a subset of progression fantasy, so while it maintains a lot of staples of the genre, Cultivation Fantasy goes about it a little bit differently. In something like lit RPG, obviously the goal is to get stronger, to progress, but Cultivation Fantasy does it in a slightly different way. Now, a lot of the hallmarks of modern Cultivation Fantasy, this is stuff that I'm all learning for the first time, so if you're also familiar, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but from my research, really seems to be based on a lot of stuff that's been coming out of China for many years, specifically Chinese webcomics. And a lot of these are focused on, and I'm going to probably butcher this, but Shenxia, which is basically translates to immortal heroes and utilizes a lot of sort of Chinese mythology and almost like religious connotations in sort of how it goes about a lot of things from like Taoism and Buddhism, sort of, the idea of the way and a personal, spiritual journey, and takes a lot of things like it rather than using like mana, it uses things like chi. So already very different. There's been a lot of series over the last few years that have sort of blown up utilizing sort of these cultivation principles and ideals. Cradle by Will White definitely being one that is thrown around a lot. But this is from an author that I hadn't heard of before, and honestly, I really enjoyed this book. It's a first-person book, which already for me is kind of like, okay. But it's done in such a way that I was kind of smiling already from the first page. This is a very sassy book. If you're someone who is not a fan of like really aggressive, sort of straightforward, like snark in your face, this sort of banter back and forth of like the character as a narrator with you, the reader, then maybe this book might not be for you quite so much. But honestly, I actually kind of got like interesting little flashbacks to like Hoyd as a narrator and Tress of the Emerald Sea. Like it was very in your face and definitely a little bit pretentious. I think it was well enough written that it got away with it though, and for me that's like such a fine balancing act. So sort of already off the rip, if you're like, oh, I don't know, Cultivation Fantasy, like this one's pretty on the nose with it too, maybe that's not for me, and sort of very, assertive first person, very strong tone of voice, maybe this one might not be for you. But if that does sound appealing to you at all, I definitely recommend this one. It definitely sits sort of on the new adult, slightly YA end of things. The protagonist, Caliban, is 22 years old, and it definitely does feel like that a little bit. There's definitely these moments of introspection that often are deep, and I actually feel like do hit that on the nose, but are almost verging on that, like, a little bit of edginess, just a touch, or really trying to be super profound. And I think generally hit the mark, which again was what impressed me so much about this, but sometimes kind of fell a little bit on that line. So let's talk about the plot a little bit here. As it follows the main character, like I said, his name is Caliban, and he is basically nobody. He's a vac welder, which basically just means that he patches the outside of space stations. He lives on this tiny space station with 17 people in the middle of nowhere. And I mean the middle of nowhere. They are out in space in like a shipping lane. And it's just him and his brother and these people that are out here on this little space station. And sort of immediately off the bat, things don't go necessarily well for him. Like the first line of the book is like, the day I died was not great. You're like, oh, it's one of those. Because essentially what happens is a cultivator arrives at the space station. Now, cultivators are well known in this universe. Like I said, they are people who can utilize chi, which is, in this case, life force. They can channel it, they can manipulate it, and they can utilize it to, do different things. Basically, it's the basis of this magic system. However, this particular cultivator is having a bad day because he's suffering from VIP, or void-induced psychosis, which essentially means that he has like drained his reserves. He's gone crazy out in the void of space, and he's trying to suck the chi out of every single person on the space station. And slight spoilers for the first chapter, he is absolutely successful, including doing it to Caliban and killing him. But in the final moment, there's like he literally explodes, and Caliban has sort of this moment of divine inspiration or elevation, and basically realizes that he can take in the void itself. He's always been like one pane of glass away from the vacuum of space. And basically no one in this universe at this point has realized that you can actually, that the void is a thing. It is a tangible thing. In this case, it actually has chi of its own. So they call it dark chi, like void chi over the course of the book. They basically know nothing about it. Like no one has ever seen anything like this before. And he ends up surviving. It basically refills his body. And through the help of Lucy, who is the soul ship, or a living, sentient little craft of the cultivator, is actually able to survive. And Jay basically feels indebted to him because of what happened. And they sort of go on a little adventure together with him in order to sort of learn more about his powers, refine, cultivate those, and sort of, figure out what the heck is going on with him because he is such an anomaly. And basically, this first book follows him essentially going to an academy, which teaches us as sort of a small, tiny little sort of backwater academy, and him, building relationships with some of the other students there. He's obviously kind of an outsider. People don't really know what's going on with him, and he's not very forthcoming with it because, they're kind of afraid they're going to turn him into a science experiment if they learn too much about him. But it's sort of about him building these relationships with these other characters, learning about his particular form of cultivation. Because, for everyone else, being able to get life force in space or on these asteroids or space stations, wherever they are, is very, very difficult. Now, they've built their nuclear reactors to basically be able to create some very weak form of chi, but that's not a lot for most people, especially if you actually want to grow and progress and build what's called your core. And this book has a very, clear series of like building up your cores through various levels, which again is sort of a hallmark of the cultivation genre. And what's really fascinating with him, of course, is that he doesn't have that problem. He just needs to reach out, and he basically has an infinite amount of chi, which is the complete opposite of everyone else who's sort of fighting for every scrap of chi they can get in this very sort of starved environment. So already he sort of has a different situation, a different position from everyone else. And he definitely causes a lot of friction with other people because for those who have watched my video on sort of He Who Fights with Monsters, Jason Asano, the key character in that book, he's a unique person. He likes to cause friction and drama with some other people. And in this case, Caliban is not quite so bad by any means, but definitely someone who is not really willing to sort of play ball with the existing hierarchy in the system. Because for 22 years of his life, he was not a cultivator. He was a nobody. He was like the lowest rung of the totem pole. And now suddenly, he's faced with a situation where he's among what are essentially nobles, but he still doesn't act like it. He befriends the person who works the front desk of his dorm room, the cleaning lady, like all these kind of people. He's someone who is willing to go to bat for the little guy. And, it definitely is a situation where it irks some people in the space, but also makes him some friends. And I do feel like that sort of more wholesome dynamic really comes through. There's definitely some wholesome vibes with this book for sure, especially, in the contrast of learning about sort of the broader threat, which is that there is sort of a looming overarching threat in this book, which I really do enjoy. This idea of these things called void beasts, which essentially creatures that live in the void of space and they hunt chi, essentially, and are trying to kill cultivators and humans, anyone who sort of has chi. And you don't get too much into it in the first book. Like, they're definitely setting up some sort of greater looming threat. Is there sort of an intelligence behind this? What's going on? Is it maybe someone who also has his kind of particular chi? Like, we don't know. This is the first book of 2 that are out right now. I've started reading the second book. As I said, I really enjoyed this first one. I think this is something that folks, if you're sort of new to this particular form of cultivation fantasy, might not actually be a bad choice. Like I said, the writing style, you're going to know in like the first 5 pages if you're going to like this book or not. It has a very, very strong tone of voice. Like, I got to give props to JP Valentine on that one. I think it would be very easy to make this book suck if it wasn't as well written. Like this, you're really trying to explore these sort of deep philosophical concepts. And it would be very, very easy to just have it be sort of an edgelord mess. And I think he does a very good job of avoiding that. So yeah, I think for me, obviously, again, I've started reading Cradle. It didn't immediately sort of lock in for me, but it's one of those ones like I'm going to go back to that at some point. But for someone who's been reading a lot of fantasy series recently, being able to read something that is so blatantly sci-fi with, or I guess science fantasy in this case, that has sort of that magic element was cool. There's definitely a lot of talk of things about like meridians and channeling your chi and activating the different powers and stuff like that are very much magic. But having it in this very blatant, almost Expanse-esque sci-fi settings of all these people who are living on these asteroids and stuff like that, I thought worked. I thought it was pretty unique. And again, I think it sort of is sold by the quality of the writing, which I did legitimately enjoy. I give this book, I think, like a 4.5 stars for me. I really enjoyed this one. And I think if you're someone who is looking to try out Cultivation Fantasy, who's maybe reading more lit RPG, this might not be the worst place to start. If you guys like this video and want to see more stuff like it, of course, be sure to like and subscribe. And I will see you all next time. Cheers.